On the morning of June 9, 1912, Villisca, Iowa was a small rural community in southwest Iowa, bustling with business, trains coming in and out, sometimes 30 a day, and its 2,500 residents thought that only good things were ahead of them. That was June 9th. June 10th would bring a grisly discovery that would change the town forever. It took the sinking of the Titanic off the front page of the papers nationwide. It sparked debate for a century to come and divided the town's residents in half. Villisca was once said to mean pretty place or pleasant view. This was described by the president of the railroad that ran through the town. Villisca was a major hub for travelers and goods traveling by rail. No one really knew at the time that Villisca is derived from the Native American word Waliska, meaning evil spirit. The town can proudly lay claim to the fact that they built the first publicly funded armory in the state of Iowa. It provided many soldiers for several wars such as the 1916 Mexican expedition, both world wars and the Korean and Vietnam conflicts. Everyone remembers the horrible tragedy that happened in June of 1912. They don't remember that the county that Villisca sits in, Montgomery County, saw more soldiers die in World War II per capita than any other county in the nation. No, Villisca is remembered for a blood event that happened more than 100 years ago. It was the evening of June 9, 1912. Josiah and Sarah Moore and their 4 children, Herman age 11, Catherine age 10, Boyd age 7 and Paul age 5, were coming out of the church after a long day of sermons and a special evening Children's Day program. By the time the day was done, it was 9:30 p.m. and dark. Very dark. The town was having a dispute with the electric company of who should be in charge of the town's street lights, and for the time being the street lights were turned off. Suffice to say, they were on the next night, the dispute forgotten after the grisly discovery the next morning. 2 friends of Catherine Moore's, Ina and Lena Stillinger, aged 12 and 8 respectively, were supposed to walk back to their grandmother's after the church service. Her house was only a couple of blocks past the Moore's house. They were to stay with their grandmother that night, and then walk home the next morning to their homestead about a mile outside of town. With the street lights being turned off, they were afraid to walk the couple of extra blocks to their grandmother's house in the dark. Catherine and her father Joe invited them to spend the night at their house, so they would be able to walk home with the family and feel safe. They could walk back to their farm the next morning as planned. Around 6 o'clock that evening, Joe Moore called the Stillinger farm from the church to get permission from the girls' parents. Even though their parents were outside and couldn't come to the phone, their older sister, Blanche, said that they could stay over and she would pass the message along to her parents. The family and their 2 overnight guests started the trek home, just a few blocks away and taking less than 10 minutes. There was a rumor that one of the children saw someone hiding in the bushes by the Moore family barn, but this has never been proven. The family came into their home and were more than likely in their beds by 11:30. The 2 Stillinger girls settled in their shared twin bed in the downstairs guest bedroom while the rest of the family retired upstairs. The sight of the family of 6 and their 2 guests disappearing into the darkness towards their home would be the last time that any of these 8 people would be seen alive. Mary Peckham was the next-door neighbor of the Moores. She was outside that morning of June 10th at 5 a.m. sharp to hang her laundry on the line. She thought it odd that none of the Moores were up yet doing chores, but didn't think anything of it until 7 a.m. when she came back out to take down her laundry and noticed that the chores had still not been done. This was unusual for the Moores and the house seemed unnaturally still and quiet. She walked across her yard and onto the front porch of the Moore residence. She knocked on the door. No answer. She tried to open the doors. Locked. After being a good neighbor and letting out the Moore's chickens to feed, she went back to her house and placed a call to Ross Moore, Joe's brother and a druggist in town. Before going to his brother's, Ross placed a call down to Joe's farm and hardware store. It hadn't been opened yet and his employee Ed Selly had went ahead and opened it for him. Ross asked Ed if he knew where Joe was. Ed called his father to see if Joe had gone to visit him on the Selly farm. His mother informed him that he had not been out there. He also in this time received a call from Mary Peckham asking if he knew where Joe was because the livestock hadn't been fed yet. He went to the moors to feed and water the livestock, but then went back to open the store again. Ross came to his brother's home to have Mary Peckham meet him on the porch. He knocked on the doors and shouted, asking if anyone was home. He went around the house, looking in all of the windows, but all of the shades had been pulled down to the sills. Coming back to the porch, he dug in his pocket for his keys, and tried each one in the front door until a skeleton key finally did the trick. He walked into the dark home. The marshal would later say it was as dark as night in there. Mary Peckham chose to stay on the porch, leaving Ross to enter the parlor and walk towards the back guest bedroom of the parlor. When he opened the door, he squinted through the darkness. When his eyes finally adjusted, he saw two figures under the bedclothes and blood splattered on the headboard of the bed and also on the wall above it. That was all he needed to see. He immediately went back outside and to Mary Peckham's, where he called Ed Selly and told him to come immediately and bring the marshal with him. City Marshal Hank Horton wasn't what you could call an experienced policeman. He was a carpenter most of his life, but thought he was strong enough to handle the life of law enforcement. He had been appointed the duty roughly 6 years earlier and spent most of his time rounding up drunks to dry them up and running hobos and tramps out of town. He had never worked a serious criminal investigation and had no police training. He arrived with Ed Selly shortly after Ross's call and continued to do what Ross could not. He took in the scene. He and Ed walked in and back to the back bedroom as Ross had done. It was so dark he had to light a match to find his way back there and view the bedroom. What lay before him was the likes the town of Villisca had never seen. Maybe not even the state of Iowa. What lay before him were the bodies of Lena and Ina Stillinger. He pulled back the bedclothes to find them both bludgeoned to death with an axe, which had been conveniently left for them to find and propped up against a wall beside the bed. It looked like a half-hearted attempt had been made to clean it, but blood and hair still were on the blade, dull and rusted from the coal it had been used to break up. In front of the bed sat an oil lamp, its chimney off and the wick turned back. A 4-pound slab of bacon wrapped in cloth that was later determined to be taken from the family's pantry set next to the lamp. The mirror had a skirt thrown over it, blocking any reflection it could put out. Ed had had enough. He walked back outside, either sickened by what he had seen or just frightened, or maybe both. Either way, Marshal Horton continued his walk through alone. He went through the first floor of the house, through the parlor and into the kitchen where the steps to the upper level were. There in the kitchen he discovered a pan of bloody water and a plate of uneaten food. He walked up the narrow and steep stairwell which opened directly into Joe and Sarah's bedroom. There he found another oil lamp in front of their bed in the same condition as the one downstairs. He found the same bloody scene, the two figures covered in bedclothes stained with blood. Pulling them back he found Joe and Sarah Moore, also murdered with the axe. Joe was unrecognizable, the upper half of his face completely gone. Sarah seemed to be hit with the sharp end of the axe, and hit with an angle, turning her face into slices which also deemed her unrecognizable. Blood had splattered on the ceiling, ran off the bed into one of Sarah's shoes. It had been knocked over and blood spilled out, and it continued to drip on the shoe. Whoever had killed them had spent time in the home. Later, the theory would be that the killer killed Joe and Sarah, and after a bit came back and knocked over the shoe when he came back to deliver more blows. The blood hadn't congealed yet, letting it flow from the shoe and drip onto it from the bed above. Bits of plaster covered the bed as well. Looking up, he discovered gouges had been cut into the slanted ceiling. The mirror in this room had also been covered with a skirt. He walked down the very short hallway to the bedroom the four Moore children shared, finding the same scene he had seen in the previous two bedrooms. All hit with an axe, all covered with bloody bedclothes and the same gouges in the slanted ceiling like he had found in Joe and Sarah's bedroom. This much was obvious. Sometime between midnight and 5 a.m., someone had come into the Moore house with an axe he found in their shed and brutally caved in each and every occupant's head with the blunt end of the axe, save for Sarah, who was hit with the sharp end. He then drew the bedclothes over all of the murdered, as if he couldn't bear to see the life draining from their faces. He then went about the home, covering all of the windows and mirrors, then proceeded to set up lamps in front of the beds with their chimneys removed and wicks turned back so the light would be minimal. He admired his handiwork by the low light. He got the bacon out of the larder and brought it to the downstairs bedroom. He went into the kitchen, washed up and then made himself a plate of food which he never ate. He then walked into the night, no one the wiser that at the time that he had just snuffed out the lives of 8 people, 6 of them children. Marshall Horton walked back down the stairs, through the kitchen and parlor and back out onto the front porch where Ross Moore and Mary Beckham waited along with Ed Selly. He looked at the Moore brother and said, "My God, Ross, there's someone murdered in every bed." The county coroner, Dr. Lindquist, was the first medical professional to arrive at the crime scene, arriving at around 9 o'clock. It wouldn't be until 10 p.m. that evening that the county attorney, name of Ratliff, gave permission for the dead to be properly examined and removed from the home. During the 13 hours in between would commence probably one of the most tainted and botched crime scenes in Iowa history. The news spread around town like wildfire. Once the girls on the switchboard down at the telephone company got wind of it, they opened a line and gave an all-points bulletin to anyone in town that had a telephone that there had been a mass murder at the Moore home. Members of the community came in droves to the Moore home. They came to the house in morbid curiosity to view the carnage for themselves. They even came and trampled through the house. The night watchman of the town was put on point to try to keep the crowds in control. When the marshal came down to ask why he was letting all of these people in, he said, "I get them away from the front door and they go around the house and into the back." No one man could stop a crowd in a frenzy. They took keepsakes, one even taking a part of Joe Moore's skull, where it was later displayed at a downtown pool hall. Another druggist in town had a Kodak camera. He would call in news reports to the Omaha World Herald on occasion and took this as his opportunity. He decided to go to the scene and try and take a few pictures with his camera. He even got a few, but after walking out of the house with his camera, Ross Moore saw him, flew into a rage and took the camera away from him, throwing it on the ground and stomping on it, exposing the film. No one thought those pictures could later be useful, even if the druggist was using it for personal gain. To this day, no photographic evidence of the crime scene exists, only pictures taken in the days after, mostly of the covered mirrors, axe, lamps and gouges in the ceiling. Sometime during that morning, a light on the telephone board down at the central telephone station lit up. The person calling was Mrs. Stillinger, the mother of Lena and Ina. She was trying to get in touch with the Moore home to inquire as to why her girls hadn't come home from their overnight stay yet. She was told that the call couldn't be connected because everyone in the home had been murdered the night before. Living outside of town, the news of the murders had not yet reached their homestead. The girls were unrecognizable, and at the time, no one knew who they were yet. A coroner's jury wasn't called until 2 o'clock that afternoon, and officials weren't even allowed until 10 p.m. that night to conduct a proper investigation of the bodies. They determined that the crime probably happened sometime after midnight. They examined the bodies the best they could under the harsh conditions, and finally around 2 a.m. moved them to the fire station, which was set up as a temporary morgue. The bodies of Joe and Sarah Moore, their 4 children and the 2 Stillinger girls lay in their death states for a probable 24 hours before being removed from the home. The bloodhounds were brought in that night. Traveling by train, they arrived and were promptly brought to the Moores' home. A crowd of hundreds eagerly awaited their arrival, but worried at the same time. The grey clouds of the day had threatened rain and the scent could be compromised. The highly trained dogs caught a scent directly off the front porch, and they led their masters in a haphazard route about town, into the moonlit countryside, and eventually into a darkened overgrown forest that led into the bottoms of the Noddaway River. A crowd of hundreds, perhaps even more than 1,000 people eagerly followed. They finally arrived at the river banks around an hour after their search commenced. There they found muddy footprints, and their masters had them cross the river, but the scent was not picked up again. They tried 2 more times the next day to pick up the scent, but without success. They soon returned by rail back to their home in Beatrice, Nebraska. A fingerprint expert was called in from Leavenworth the next day. He was good. He had studied at Oxford and trained at Scotland Yard in the new science. There was only one problem. When he arrived, he was so drunk that he needed assistance getting off of the train car. They took him to a hotel where they sobered him up, and the day after that, he proceeded to do his investigation of the home. Although he was unable to find any usable prints, probably in large part it to being a new science and half the town running through the home, he was able to do blood spatter analysis and analyze the gouges in the ceiling. He was able to determine from the gouges that the killer was left-handed and at what angle he had hit his victims. He also determined that the gouges in the ceiling of the 4 children's bedroom were unlike the ones in Joe and Sarah's. The gouges were directly above the floor on the ceiling. The roof being gabled, the walls were sharply sloped. He determined by the blood splatter and the height of the uppermost part of the ceiling that at one point, the killer was in a frenzy and swung the axe above his head, gouging out parts of the ceiling and spattering blood about the room. Rumors started immediately flying around town. Some blamed it on Joe Moore's brother-in-law, Sam Moyer, who had previously divorced Joe's sister and had been proven to be troublesome and had a bad temperament. Others believed that it was a Native American from Oklahoma, who had been hired by the widow of a prominent businessman in Villisca who had been killed in a race riot the year previous. She, now living in Oklahoma, hired the Indian to come up and kill the person responsible, but the Indian got the wrong house. Joe Moore lived 11 houses west of the church. The person responsible lived 11 houses north. There was a belief that footprints of the Indian were found in front of the porch of the Moore home, looking to be made from moccasins. Some even believed that they would catch the killer in no time, that authorities were able to get a photograph of the murderer, obtained from the retina of Sarah Moore's eye. What they didn't know is that her eyes were gone, destroyed by the axe. As time passed, however, the list of suspects drew shorter and more credible. To this day, there is one that most of the town believed had a hand in it. F. Jones, banker, businessman, competitor of Joe Moore and eventual state senator. Frank Fernando Jones was by all accounts a prominent man about town in Villisca. He was an upstanding and prominent member of the local Methodist church. He was starting a bank, he was a state senator, he ran his own farm implement and hardware business. He wasn't the wealthiest man in Villisca, but maybe one of the most prominent. Despite all of his ambition and respect, heads almost immediately turned to him when the murders happened. He would eventually become the subject of a grand jury investigation in the murders. but was never indicted. It wasn't a secret that FF and Joe Moore weren't on the friendliest of terms. In fact, they were far from it. Up until 5 years previous, Joe Moore had been one of the top salesmen in FF's farm implement business. He was a good worker, brought in good money for the company, but he was getting tired of the hours. He was forced to work 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. 6 days a week, only taking the Sabbath off as Jones was a good Methodist. It didn't help that Joe was a Presbyterian either, as the town was sharply divided in half between the two religions. In 1907, Joe decided to branch out and start his own farm and implement business. The only problem was that he took the biggest account with him, the John Deere franchise. Of course, this being the name for farm implements and a lucrative account, this did not set well with FF. Jones also had a daughter-in-law, Donna Jones, married to FF's son, Albert, who was generally known to be an overweight bumbling fool. No one was ever really quite sure why the beautiful school teacher from a small one-room classroom in the country would ever marry Albert. Perhaps it was for financial security, perhaps it was her chance to get into society, which was still very much regimented in 1912, especially in Villisca. Either way, she was known as a temptress and rumored to be having affairs with at least 3 men in town, one of them Joe Moore, purportedly her favorite. It wasn't exactly a secret. However beautiful, she lapsed in her judgment when she decided to set up her trysts by telephone, a medium that would allow the girls down at the telephone company to easily listen in at any time. She would often receive calls from her gentleman callers asking if it was okay to come over. She would state clear as day, either oblivious to the fact that they were being listened to, or not caring, that either no, Albert was home, or yes, they could come on over. The girls down at the telephone company would usually tell anyone who would listen what they had heard between Donna and her lovers. Albert, being the ignorant fellow that he was, seemed oblivious to the affairs. The animosity between Jones and Moore got so bad that it was said that they would go out of their way and cross the street to avoid speaking or coming across one another. The town, as small towns predictably do, was split down the middle as to Jones's innocence. The Presbyterians were all but sure that Jones was involved. The Methodists couldn't believe such a thing could have been done by such a fine upstanding member of their church. Everyone seemed to agree on one thing, however. Jones, a man of 57 at the time, didn't seem to have the strength or the vigor to be able to so brutally slay 8 people with an axe. The Methodists used this as their basis on Jones's innocence with connection to his membership in the church. The Presbyterians said, well, he must have hired someone to do it. After all, he didn't seem like the kind of man that would want to get his hands dirty. Who could have he possibly hired? From the day that Detective James Newton Wilkinson, a detective with a good reputation out of the Burns Agency in Kansas City, second largest in the world, caught wind of the case and stepped off the rail from Kansas City in Villisca, he was sure of 2 things. F.F. Jones was the man responsible for the murders of the Moore family and 2 Stillinger girls, and Blackie Mansfield was the man who was hired to do it. He even gave Mansfield the nickname. It was because of this that for a long time after the murders, there was a misconception that an African American had done it. It wasn't until the middle of the century or a little after that blacks were allowed to live in the town again. Wilkinson came to Villisca not long after the murders, posing as a Texas land agent, but secretly investigating the murders, Jones and Mansfield. Blackie Mansfield, aka George Wally, aka Jack Turnbull, was a cocaine fiend and serial murderer according to Wilkinson. Blackie often traveled around for work, and a few eyewitness accounts of him boarding a train in Clarinda, a town nearby, early the morning the bodies were discovered. These accounts were quickly proven to either be false or remembered incorrectly during testimony when his grand jury convened. Wilkinson latched onto the Jones and Mansfield connection with a vengeance. although there was no proof that either man had an affiliation with each other. He posted flyers about town and held meetings in open pastures by the lamplight of automobiles. One of the flyers with a picture of Mansfield said, "This is the axe murderer. He murdered the Moore family at Villisca. The hypocrite whose dirty money paid for the hellish job wants your support for the state senate. Will he get it?" The only evidence that Wilkinson had is that Mansfield was in the vicinity of Villisca the night of the murders, again testimony that was later shot down in court. That and 2 years later, in 1914, his wife, infant child, mother-in-law and father-in-law were all murdered with an axe. A crime in which he was the chief suspect, but never charged. Similar murders had also happened around the Midwest around the time of the Villisca murders. During the autumn months of September and October 1911 in Colorado Springs, Colorado, Monmouth, Illinois, and Ellsworth, Kansas, the violent crimes were very similar. They involved families sleeping in their beds, struck down with either an axe or a weapon of opportunity. They all happened on a weekend. The weapon was left out to be easily found. All of the victims were covered in their bedclothes and were all killed by vicious blows to the head, administered in the dark of the night. The killer in a couple of cases was thought to have returned to administer more blows after the first ones, a theory that was brought up in the Villisca investigation. However coincidental, Blackie didn't have ties to any of these murders, save for the one of his family. That didn't stop Wilkinson though. To him, Blackie was the man who fit the bill. He raised enough fuss that finally caused a grand jury to convene and arrest Mansfield in 1916. He was brought up from Kansas City and put in front of the jury, where after the evidence was presented that he had a solid alibi for working in Chicago at the time, he was dismissed. Wilkinson hemmed and hawed that F.F. Jones had enough influence and money to fake these documents, but the theory was never proved and no one else from Wilkinson's evidence was ever charged. The only thing he had managed to do was cause Jones to lose his re-election for senator. Jones promptly sued Wilkinson for slander, a case which he won, but his reputation was never the same again. Mansfield spent the rest of his life in Minnesota as a union organizer, and never had any run-ins with the law again. The second suspect, Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the Moore family, wasn't what you could call the investigation's most viable suspect, having showed no motive, or even being in Villisca at the time of the killings, but he certainly showed the tendency to kill. He had been released from a reformatory from a forgery charge shortly before the string of homicides began in the fall of 1911. Shortly after the crime in Villisca in 1912, Moore was convicted of the murders by an axe of his mother and maternal grandmother in Columbia, Missouri. A federal officer assigned to the Villisca case, a man by the name of M.W. McClockery, announced in 1913 that not only had he solved the Villisca case, but murders of 22 other people around the Midwest that occurred around the same time of the Villisca murders. His theory was largely ignored, maybe in part due to the fact that no evidence tied Moore to the crimes in Villisca, maybe in part due to the fact that investigators and townsfolk alike had already laid their eyes on 3 other main, more viable suspects. More than likely, the other investigators in the Villisca murders ignored him because it had been proven that the murders of Moore's mother and grandmother were attributed to greed. He had planned to take the deed to the family's house after their deaths. Although he was a suspect by many law enforcement agencies in the killing spree of 1911 and 1912, mainly due to the fact that they started shortly after he was released from prison and stopped after he was arrested for his family's murders, he was never charged with any of them, save for his family's, where there was blood evidence of the crime in his hotel room. He only served 35 years of a life sentence before being released on parole. The investigation's main suspect, Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly, wasn't a man that you would notice if you passed him on the street. He was a small wiry man, standing only 5'2" and weighing 120 pounds, soaking wet. No, he wasn't a man that you would notice, but he would make sure you noticed him. The Reverend, born in England, immigrated to the United States in 1904. He found that speaking God's word was his calling, and following in his father's and grandfather's footsteps, joined the Methodists to train to become a preacher. After a few years, he decided you couldn't pinch a penny out of a Methodist no matter how hard you tried, saying a man could starve working for the Methodists. So he moved to Omaha with his wife and joined the Presbyterian Seminary. He wasn't to begin his classes until September of 1912. However, the seminary president arranged for him to serve 3 country churches that summer, all in the vicinity of Villisca. It was because of this that Reverend Kelly found himself in Villisca the weekend of June 8th and 9th, 1912. Being the house guest of the Presbyterian minister and his wife, Reverend Kelly quietly attended the children's church service the evening of June 9th. He left early the next morning on the 5:19 a.m. train back to Macedonia, a small town near Villisca where he had been staying during the summer. Once hearing of the murders, and realizing the fact that he was in the town the night that they occurred, he quickly became obsessed. He wrote countless, long, rambling letters that didn't seem to make much sense to the people that he sent them to. He sent letters to local and state investigators, private detectives, and even more morbid, the relatives of the victims. He came again to Villisca 2 weeks later for another visit to the Presbyterian minister, and decided to make the 2-block trek from the minister's house to the home of the Moores where the tragedy occurred. As luck would have it, investigators were standing on the porch discussing the case when they arrived, and posing as a seasoned inspector from Scotland Yard, Kelly and his fellow preacher were admitted to the home for a tour. After a month or so, his letters started to attract attention. A detective from the Hayes Detective Agency wrote a flattering letter asking Kelly for details of the night of the murder. Kelly wrote back to him and other detectives with details that were outlandish or downright incriminating. He claimed to hear the thud of the axe. He claimed the killer stepped up on the porch of the Moores to let a couple out walking pass by. He claimed that Sarah Moore had reared up in bed before she was struck with the axe. Kelly was quietly investigated throughout the summer of 1912, none of the investigation being made public. However, he was not arrested or charged, more than likely due to the fact that he was a minister, and also quite insane. He was also a man of small stature, described by some as bird-like, and some found it hard to believe that he could be strong enough to inflict such damage and swing a heavy axe crazily above his head hard enough to do damage to a ceiling 8 feet high. Kelly showed up in law enforcement's peripherals again in 1914, when he put an ad in the paper for a stenographer. He was writing a novel, seemingly innocent enough, right? Well, you would be wrong. When a young 18-year-old girl from South Dakota responded to the ad, he replied by saying that she would get the job, but only if she typed in the nude. After the girl turned the letter into the postal authorities, post office officials sent dummy letters to Kelly to gather more evidence. After his replies became more and more suggestive, he was charged with sending obscene material through the mail. Rather than face a prison sentence, he was sent to Washington, D.C. for 6 months to serve in the nation's mental hospital. He underwent intense therapy there, also confessing to some there that he was worried that he would be arrested for the axe murders. After a grand jury failed to indict Blackie Mansfield and F.F. Jones for their murders, one person said, "We've got to look at that crazy preacher over in Nebraska." However, the state had already been quietly building a case against Kelly while Wilkinson was out and about shouting to the world that it was Jones and Mansfield. They included a few main points in their case against Kelly: his obvious disturbed mental state and sexual deviancy, a bloody shirt that he had sent to Council Bluffs to be cleaned a week after the murder, His talk of the murder before it had been discovered and the fact that he had been caught peeping in a window watching a woman undress just days before the murders. He had also tried to convince two 13-year-olds in Carroll, Iowa while preaching to pose nude for him. They declined, thankfully. It wasn't long into the summer of 1917 when Reverend Kelly was finally arrested for the murder of Lena Stillinger, specifically. The state felt that they had the strongest case against him for Lena because after her death, her undergarments had been removed and she had been positioned to reveal her genitalia. This became even clearer when an expert, all the way from Oregon, said that the slab of bacon was the key. His theory was that the killer had rolled it up and used it as an artificial vagina while viewing Lena by the low lamplight by the lamp placed in front of the bed. It had been said that Lena, aged 12 at the time, was almost a full-grown woman. In fact, some of the first people in the house after the bodies were discovered and identified thought she was an adult. During the summer of 1917, Kelly was repeatedly interrogated. He had been moved from the county courthouse in Red Oak to another jail in Stanton, Iowa in secret. This wasn't because they feared he was violent, but because they thought that supporters of Wilkinson and his theory against Jones and Mansfield would come and try to free him. The detectives interrogated him without success. They couldn't get the confession they were looking for. Finally, on August 30, 1917, they tried one last-ditch effort. He was dragged into an interrogation room from his jail cell to meet the main investigators on the case, including the Iowa State Attorney General himself, Horace Havner. All through the night, being big burly men themselves, they played the bad cop role, occasionally letting him back to his cell for breaks. There he was joined by two men he thought to be thieves, who assured him from their criminal experience that it would be easier on him if he confessed. These men playing the good cops were in all reality a newspaper editor and a deputy sheriff. Finally, around 7 a.m. the next morning, Kelly broke down. He dictated his confession. The story he wove was chilling. He claimed that he had trouble sleeping the night of the murders, so he decided to go out for a walk. While walking down the street, he claimed to see a light burning in the window of the Moore house and the two Stillinger children. He heard the Lord's voice commanding him to suffer the children to come unto me. Finding himself in a trance, he walked into the yard of the Moores and picked up the axe, which conveniently laid against the coal shed. Before entering the home, he heard the Lord's voice commanding him again to slay and slay utterly. He walked through the kitchen door and proceeded to the back bedroom and killed Lena and Ina Stillinger. He heard the voice of the Lord again, saying, "More work to be done." He went up the stairs and killed Joe and Sarah Moore. Yet again, he heard the Lord's voice, "Still more work to be done." He went into the adjoining bedroom and killed all four of the Moore children. He stayed in the house until first light, and then proceeded to make his way to the first train out of town. Law enforcement officials felt that now, they had their case wrapped up in a bow. The trial was to start September 4, 1917. It was Iowa's trial of the century. A public spectacle, it was standing room only, in the small courtroom of the Montgomery Courthouse in Red Oak, Iowa. Kelly, who was fresh from his confession and who purportedly had a bruise on his cheek, was set to stand trial in the murder of Lena Stillinger. His wife sat behind him, always faithful and with a half-smile on her face that stood through the trial, even through the most graphic of testimonies. One by one, witnesses were pulled up. Attorney General Havner was lead prosecutor on the case, but the testimonies weren't going as well as he thought they could. The launderer from Council Bluffs, after being cross-examined by the defense, said he couldn't be sure if the shirt had blood on it. Could it be ketchup? Possibly. The couple on the train who had heard Kelly talking about the murders before the bodies were discovered had their testimony derailed when the defense proposed that they might have seen Kelly on the train 2 weeks after the murders when he had gone to Villisca again. After all, this was an elderly couple and their memories may not be what they used to be. They started to doubt themselves and their testimony for the prosecution was out the window. It also didn't help that by the time the trial began that the majority of Montgomery County citizens felt that Kelly was being framed by F.F. Jones and Blackie Mansfield. Although they had a suspect in custody, Wilkinson was still out and about with his public forums. Officials were so fed up with him that he had been forced to cross state lines and speak in Nebraska, where there were no gag rules. The public was sure that F.F. Jones had Havner in his pocket. The case against Kelly slowly fell apart, mainly due to testimony that had good reasonable doubt put on it, the fact that Kelly was feeble, perhaps even beaten and had a confession forced out of him. He was obviously sexually deranged and insane, but few felt him capable of committing the murders. The trial lasted until September 26, and then the jury was sent into deliberation. There they were deadlocked 11-1 for acquittal, only one juror feeling that Kelly should be found guilty by reason of insanity. The jury was hung, and the trial ended without a verdict. The state, despite having the odds against them, decided on a second trial, and a short trial commenced in November of 1917. It was mostly cursory, no witnesses being called, the transcript from the first trial being read to the jurors. The state produced no new evidence or witnesses. The trial ended in a verdict of not guilty for Kelly and he was acquitted. The case was at a dead end. Kelly had been acquitted. No grand jury would indict Jones or Mansfield. The serial killer that had been so deadly in 1911 and 1912 had not struck again. Officials believed that Wilkinson had so poisoned the opinions and minds of the public that the real killer would never be found. The case remains open, never solved. The last trial ended at the end of 1917, and local residents and the rest of America's minds were turning elsewhere, across an ocean where their soldiers fought in the Great War. In 1918, Wilkinson tried to get into the State Bar of Iowa. He wanted to become county attorney for Montgomery County. Horace Havner, so angered by this, made it his mission to see that Wilkinson would never get his license in the state of Iowa. He had a long dossier of Wilkinson's more shady dealings and produced some criminal history on him as well. Wilkinson never practiced law in the state of Iowa. Today, Villisca's residents are still as divided on who did it as they were back in 1912. Throughout the 20th century, there was a staunch line drawn down the middle of the town. Children of Jones supporters were not allowed to play with the children of the Kelly supporters. Lips were sealed. And for much of the century, if you were to go to the county courthouse or the city hall to look for documents made public on the murders, you were promptly told that they no longer existed. Villisca is now half the size it was in 1912. The railroad left, leaving all of the travelers that once made business boom downtown to take the new interstate system to bigger cities like Des Moines and Omaha to do their dealings. The farm crisis of the 1980s brought the population down even further. Today, people in Villisca are a bit more open-minded than they used to be about talking about the murders, mostly due to the fact that the elderly that once had heard first-hand accounts from their parents are now gone. There are still some though, even 105 years later, that say you should let sleeping dogs lie. In the early 1990s, the home that once housed the Moore family was purchased and proceeded through a renovation that the town had dreaded for nigh on 80 years. The man who bought it, Darwin Lynn, was restoring it to the condition it was in the day the Moores died. You walked in the door and you walked into 1912. The mirrors were covered, there were lamps in front of the beds. The axe was put up for display in his museum downtown. The town was afraid it would be made into a spectacle. He assured everyone that he was doing this for historical purposes only and that he wanted to preserve this piece of history that had put Villisca on the map. It was in the late 1990s and early 2000s that the paranormal groups started coming to the house. Special gatherings on Halloween happened in the house and the front lawn. The house, said to be one of the most haunted homes in America, has seen countless paranormal groups come in and out throughout the years with their ghost boxes, EVP recorders and endless questions to the ghosts as to who done it. TV shows such as The Ghost Adventures and The Dead Files have been through, the former capturing compelling evidence of ghost interaction. If the house is truly haunted, and I believe it is, there is too much evidence of it to say otherwise. These ghosts were awakened when the sledgehammer came down on the house's walls. They relive the crime every day, when tours come through. They have people come in with their funny-looking electrical machines and ask endless questions. What's your name? Who killed you? Why are you still here? Is the killer here too? According to Amy Allen of The Dead Files, a leading psychic, these people are in pain every day. They relive the crime every day. They don't know it's 2017. They don't know that they've been stuck for more than 100 years. They haven't known peace since that night of June 9, 1912. There is no light for them to go towards. It was because of this horrific crime that not a dog was to be bought that day in 1912. Hardware stores sold out of guns. Locks sold out, families moved in together for safety. Future years would see the Moore and Stillinger families refusing to let their children stay over at friends' houses. The grandson of Ross Moore even had a gun pulled on him one night when he was a teenager by his father. Coming home late, he had failed to make noise while coming in the house, despite having his father warning him many times to make as much noise as possible when coming home. The innocence of the early 20th century is long gone everywhere now. Villisca had it stolen in 1912, well before anyone else. It is a crime whose victims will never be addressed, and a killer who will never be found.